One of the things that I wanted to say about your mother that in terms of my admiration for her, very early, I remember her standing in Relief Society announcing that she was struggling with depression at a time when people didn't talk about those things openly, and how many women sought her out to say, I have the same problem. And so I think that kind of courage and honesty was part of her character. And that was, it helped me because there was a time early on when I felt, there's something wrong with Ruth and there's nothing wrong with me. And, when I finally got into therapy, because I recognized that that was not fair to her and it wasn't really true, then I began to find that I could be more authentic, and I could also begin to understand something about my own childhood. I was very blessed to have really good therapists and people who helped me begin to, I found therapy an extremely liberating. It was frightening to me, but I also found it, and have found it my whole life, a very liberating experience.
It must have been scary to look at those things from your past, because I bet that you worked pretty hard to put a lot of distance between.
I did. I did. I remember Dr. Alan Shore, who's one of the world's authorities on certain disorders. He was my first therapist, and I can remember him saying to me, "You're very articulate, Bob, but there's a 10-foot glass wall between us, and you've got to decide if it's going to come down, otherwise I can't help you." And of course, my first response, "What do you mean?"
Let me just shine that up a little bit.
But he was very good. One of the recurring dreams I had was that I kept seeing this baby or this small child who was in danger of flood or fire or something, and I would have nightmares about this child, and I would wake up in cold sweats, and I was telling him, I said, I keep having this dream, and he said, "Who's that little boy?" And I said, "I have no idea." He said, "Look." and then I realized that I was dreaming and trying to save that little boy who was in danger, and really was in danger. But that was really helpful for me, because once I acknowledged that, the dream stopped. Once I understood who that was, and that I could, as an adult, begin to take care of that boy. And also because I really was a loving person, and found it easy to love other people, and was, I think, enormously blessed to have so many people in my life that loved me and that I loved. So that early, very unstable period, which I think I remember telling you that by the time I was 10, I had been abandoned 10 times, and in very frightening and unsettling and unsecure environments. So I had a lot of growing up to do. I still feel I do. I'm still finding ways to uncover those childhood traumas, and to be a better, more loving person than I have been in the past.
How do you think you were able to overcome so much abuse and trauma and function as well as you did, given, you look at Gloria, you look at Evelyn, look at Uncle Bill, and, Clayton's life until the dissolution of his marriage with Sharon.
Yeah.
That's...
I don't know. I think it's a very good question. I think I mentioned this earlier in my recording this history, that there were three things that really, Brutal Bettelheim, the child psychologist, said that for every child to survive a difficult childhood, all they need is the assurance that they are loved unconditionally by one person. And I knew that Dad did.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because he was also the cause of a lot of...
He was.
of abandonment and abuse and what was hard.
Yeah, but I think that,
But you always knew that in spite of it?
yeah, it's difficult. I think that it's a combination of things. Who knows? We are each unique from this. I think that I was blessed with a good disposition, a positive disposition. I really was a happy child in spite of all of that. I didn't know enough to be aware that I was really poor. And when there wasn't enough to eat, I assumed that was the case with everybody, I think. So I had that disposition. But I also, what's really interesting to me is that from a very early age, I knew I didn't want that life. I set out in defiance of the kind of life my parents and the other people in my life lived. And I set myself, again, I just, especially when I became a teenager, that I was determined I was not going to repeat their serial marrying and their alcoholism and all of that.
Did you have examples of a different life, or you just knew you wanted to turn your back on that?
I didn't really have examples of another life. Certainly in the first 10 years of my life, I didn't. Once I joined the church when I was 10, there were other more stable adults and families. But I can remember when I had my paper route, when I was 13, I remember writing down at night or in the evening when I go to collect for the newspaper. I remember looking into houses and seeing families. And one of the other dreams that I had, one of the other recurring dreams I had, which is really interesting, is looking into houses where there was a warm glow of light and people were sitting down at a table and there were loving parents and there was kindness and there was food on the table. And I remember that Alan Shore said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to be part of that family. He said, why don't you go in there and imagine yourself going into that home and those people loving you. And I think that early imagining the kind of home I wanted to live in and that I wanted to create for my own children was again because I could just see how terrible it was not to know if your parents were coming home, or not to know if they were coming back, or not to know if when they came home if they would be out of control, and not to know whether there would be food on the table. And I just knew that I couldn't provide anything other than the opposite of that for my children. And so my life was really, in some sense, so Dad's love, the church became a stable foundation for me very early. And even though I was at 14 going to church by myself, I knew that was a good place for me to be. And then to have the absolute blessing and good fortune to find your mother. Those things gave me, I think, the love that your mother gave me the consistent, stable love that I never had. And that was really, in some sense, the most important thing. To know that God loved me, to know my father loved me, and to know that your mother loved me was all I needed to try and be a responsible spouse and father.
What about Granddad's life made him incapable of providing that for his children?
He was, it's so interesting. I look back, I just reread his life history. In many ways, it's really tragic because he got married before he should have, as he and mom were too young. Life on the farm or the ranch was hard. But there's something interesting that I had forgotten about, which was that from a very early age, Dad was depressed. He had a serious depression. And it would be hard to see that if you were around him just on, because he was always kind of so charismatic and ebullient and all of that. But there was that dark side of him, which he said from a very early age, he said, I couldn't talk to people. I couldn't express my feelings. So I think that was part of it, and that led to self-medication pretty early. But they were extremely poor. I mean, this was the height of the Depression, and it was finding work, finding enough food to put on the table, and we'll talk about it in the next episode.